Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me is former Congressman Mel Levine, former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We welcome back and thank tonight's special guest, Ambassador Dennis Ross, for what will surely be an instructive update. It's certainly been a day of news in the Middle East, so we're anxious to hear the updates. We are so grateful for your willingness to keep our audience informed. And thanks also to the outstanding Patt Morrison for your always incisive and probing interviewing of our guests. I want to remind everybody that every single program we do is recorded and resides on the past events link on our website and on our YouTube channel called America at a Crossroads. There's also a podcast link that we send out with every email. It's a very frequent question I get. So just try to tell your friends that you can watch all these programs after the fact if you can't join us live. This week, we observe Holocaust Remembrance Day, as well as Yom HaZikaron, the day on which we remember those who died during Israel's War of Independence and in other of Israel's wars. In an essay written by Yossi Klein Halevi, which was sent to you in this morning's email, and which will be sent again in the email you'll get right after tonight's program, Yossi notes that irrespective of your feelings about the policies or actions of any particular Israeli government or leader, including the current one, there has been a years-long systematic effort to discredit the Holocaust and Zionism. By Zionism, I simply mean the right of the existence of a Jewish state. These sentiments are felt more keenly right now because of the war in Gaza, the huge death tolls, and the rising popularity of a movement which not only supports a Palestinian state, as so many Jews do as well, by the way, but a growing movement which is anti-Zionist, meaning against the existence of a Jewish state. As we mark the 2 days of remembrance, we should be mindful not to fall into the trap being set by so many vocal protesters. While we can agree or disagree with Israel's policies and the way it is prosecuting this war and about so many other issues, we must resist the sentiment being espoused by many that Israel has no right to exist and that the Holocaust is some type of an exaggerated myth and that its goal was something other than the elimination of the Jewish people. In Klein Halevi's article, he wrote, quote, "Anti-Semitism is not merely the hatred of Jews as other, but the symbolization of the Jew, that is, turning the Jews into a symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as its most loathsome qualities. For Christianity until the Holocaust, the Jew was the Christ killer. For Marxism, the ultimate capitalist. For Nazism, the defiler of race. And now in the era of anti-racism, the Jewish state is the embodiment of racism," close quote. Disagree with policies and leaders, that's fair, but on these days of remembrance, let us clearly affirm the right of the Jewish people to have a state. It really seems shocking that such a statement needs affirmation. As we remember the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, whose descendants comprise 50% of Israel's Jewish population, and the other 50%, of course, is comprised of Jews who were banished from Arab countries, and those who gave their lives to the formation of the Jewish state, let us not allow our own story and our voices to be replaced or drowned out by the voices of those attempting to delegitimize Jews, Israel, and Zionism. On Wednesday, May 8th, that's next Wednesday at 5 p.m., join us as we host two very highly respected pollsters, Celinda Lake and Paul Maslin. Surely we are all highly attuned to the polls and have a barrage of information each day about their validity and their reliability and whether they actually impact elections. Celinda and Paul are the best in the business and will be able to directly address your questions. They will be in conversation with Warren only on the topic, political polling, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The following week, we will have the former governor of Arizona and former secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, who will discuss how safe are we, a frank assessment about the condition of the security of the homeland. Now to introduce tonight's speaker and our moderator, please welcome my colleague and friend, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel?
Thank you, Janice, and thank you for your important remarks. I am very pleased to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross again. No one is better equipped to discuss the Israel-Gaza situation, both in terms of the war and also in terms of its implications. And I want to say it's extremely generous and gracious of Dennis to bring us up to date on these issues from time to time. Situation changes regularly. even today, there are back and forth reports about is there or isn't there some form of an agreement. I'm sure Dennis will discuss it. As our audience may know by now, Dennis has had an extraordinary career, having advised Presidents George H.W. Bush, Sr., President Clinton, and President Obama on Middle East policies, and being centrally involved for decades with regard to Middle East peace negotiations. He remains one of the most highly regarded experts on these issues, and as recently as this week, Dennis wrote a provocative and, in my view, excellent article in Foreign Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations magazine on foreign policy, entitled Why Israel Should Declare a Unilateral Ceasefire in Gaza, a chance to turn the tables on Hamas and Iran and advance normalization on Saudi Arabia. As always, it is his creativity and thoughtfulness that's compelling, and we are especially pleased that he's here with us this evening. Dennis will be interviewed by our wonderful Patt Morrison, who we are extremely fortunate to have as a regular interviewer. Patt is a superstar writer and columnist for the Los Angeles Times and a much heralded and honored and awarded broadcast journalist for NPR. Patt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you to all of you who are joining us about the significant developments on this very significant day in history, and we'll find out how much more significant it may yet become with Ambassador Ross. And Ambassador, listening to conflicting reports, events unrolling 1 or 2 minutes at a time, matters are changing, information changing. I'm reminded, I think it was Churchill at some critical juncture in World War II who warned, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it may be the end of the beginning. And perhaps you can begin by helping us to tease out where matters stand in all of these conflicting reports that we have been spending the day listening to and wondering about.
Okay. First, Pat, nice to be with you again, and thank you, Mel, for your kind words. Yeah, I think what is going on is that there has been a major U.S. effort to try to produce a hostage deal. I will come back to this as we discuss all this, because the U.S. role, I think, is pivotal in this regard. It's been significant in terms of, I think, involving Egypt and Qatar in terms of being mediators. And there's clearly been a major U.S. effort to see if, in fact, we could produce a hostage deal, which would then set in motion a train of events that start with a 6-week pause. So where are we right now? Egypt took an Israeli proposal, which Secretary of State Tony Blinken described as being very generous, presented it to Hamas. I think that Egypt, in presenting it, probably also put some pressure on. To some extent, I think Qatar did as well. It took several days for Hamas to respond, and their response today was one that was characterized as accepting the proposal. I would have to say that's a kind of generous way of describing their response. Their response showed some, I would say, some flexibility. It showed some responsiveness to the proposal, but what they came back with was a revision of what had been presented, what the Israelis had presented, and to the point where Israel is saying, this is not the proposal that we made, but we are sending a team to Cairo, to Egypt anyway, to follow up and discuss it. At the same time that Israel is doing that, they have begun an effort in the eastern part of Rafah. I want to put this in some perspective. We have been hearing for 2 months that Israel is going to carry out a ground offensive into Rafah. Rafah is the major crossing point between Egypt and Gaza. Next to it is something called the Philadelphia Corridor. This is the area above ground and below ground to which most of the weaponry and materials have been smuggled into Gaza. Israel is also contending with the fact that while they have dismantled 19 of the 24 Hamas battalions, there are 4 that are in Rafah. So I've said for 2 months, Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about moving into Rafah. He had made a promise at that time to President Biden that Israel would not move into Rafah until it had evacuated the 1.4 million Palestinians who had largely crammed into this area. These are Palestinians who have moved on a number of occasions to get away from the fighting. In this particular case, the evacuations did not begin until this week. I personally took the Netanyahu position as being an indication that he was posturing rhetorically, but he wasn't really acting on the threats. This week, we began to see evacuation plans. We began to see some people evacuating. And yesterday, we saw a major effort at getting Palestinians to evacuate from this eastern neighborhood of Rafah. We're talking about less than 100,000 people out of the 1.3 to 1.4 million people who have been in Rafah. It is in this area where we've seen evacuation. It's in this area where today we saw the Israelis move in on the ground. Now, this is significant in part because I think the timing is driven by 2 factors. Factor number 1, yesterday there were mortars fired from this area and a rocket at Kerem Shalom, which was one of the crossing points that Israel opened up as a result of pressure from President Biden for humanitarian assistance. Hamas fired these mortars and a rocket at Kerem Shalom. There were Israeli soldiers who were out in the open. 4 were killed. Another 7 or 8 were wounded. I think part of the reason for the ground effort into Eastern Rafah today is a result of that attack, and this is a response. But it's also a result of Israel trying to put pressure on Hamas to basically accept what was the proposal that was made. We've now seen a Hamas response, which is not an acceptance, but I would also say not a rejection. And also, I think for the first time in my mind, we've seen Hamas basically look like it was trying to say, or at least present itself as saying yes, not no to one of these proposals.
So we may have an agreement to a ceasefire, but it's a different ceasefire for each side. Before we get into the politics, domestic and here and in Israel and the Middle East, what are the primary stakes in these ceasefire negotiations, the primary commitments and dedications to this is our principal concern?
Okay, so let me kind of approach this from a couple of different directions. So why has the U.S. been so focused on trying to get it? At one level, just for humanitarian reasons. You're talking about 136 hostages who are still being held. When I say that, that means people who are alive and those who are not alive. We know that more than a month ago, the IDF informed 32 families that of this 136, 32 were no longer alive. There have since been additional numbers who the Israelis have announced are also not alive. So there's just one of the things driving the Biden administration has been the imperative to try to get hostages released, not only because it's the morally right thing to do, not only because the conditions in which they're held are horrendous, but also because they want to get hostages released while there are hostages who are still alive. We know that Hamas, 10 days ago, in responding to pressures on the negotiations, after having previously accepted the idea that in the first phase there would be 40 hostages released, hostages who were under the age of 19, all the women hostages who were remaining, and those who were elderly or sick. They had previously been talking about 40. 10 days or so, they came out and said, well, there's only 20 who are still alive who fit that category. That has created an additional sense of urgency, I think, on the part of the administration, and certainly on the part of families, and it's created more pressure within Israel itself to move on the hostage deal.
Can I just interject to ask,
Please.
Are these only the hostages that are held by Hamas? Are the hostages that may be in other hands not taken into consideration? Are they beyond the reach of Hamas's negotiations?
Hamas, when we had the first set of releases back in November, Hamas suggested that they did not have control over all the hostages and it would take them some time to get control of them. We know that Islamic Jihad is holding some. We know that in some cases there are some families, prominent families, that may be holding some as well. If that's the case, it's because Hamas allowed, made a decision to disperse the hostages and disperse them not only physically to different areas, but also having them held by different groups as well. So this is kind of the broad stake, the sense of imperative. But there's something more that's been driving the administration. The Biden administration has looked at this as, if we could produce a pause at a minimum 6 weeks, this would do two things. One, it would allow a structure to be put in place on the ground to address the humanitarian needs of the people in Gaza. There still are concerns, we know from the World Food Program, of famine in the northern part of Gaza. That's not been the case so much in the southern part, but it is the case in the northern part. There is a desire to ensure that the quantity of humanitarian assistance can get in, but more importantly, that a distribution system is actually set up that is consistent, systematic, and make sure that everyone who in need is receiving it, that it's not being diverted. There still are very significant problems with distribution, even with dramatically more assistance going in, number one. Number two, the administration believes if it can get a pause, it can finalize a package to normalize between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, for that, the administration believes there needs to be a pause. I have to admit, I was in Saudi Arabia last week, and what I was hearing from the administration about the need for a pause to be able to close, ironically, was not what I was hearing from the Saudis. The Saudi position was, we're ready to close now if the administration is in a position to present a finalized deal to us, and including what is the Palestinian component. We're waiting for the administration to present that to us. Now, it may be the administration also wants to pause because if it changes the climate, it thinks it's also easier to put together and finalize this package. That may be the case. But I was struck by the fact that what I was hearing here is not what I was hearing in Riyadh. The key here, however, is, again, I think the administration believes if you produce this package, that in itself will then put Israel in a position where it has a chance to become not just normalizing with Saudi Arabia, but it will become part of what can be a regional coalition, which is ultimately the best way to be able to compete and counter Iran and its proxies. And one last word on this. We know from what happened on April 14th, which was the Israeli response, on April 14th is what the Iranians did, firing over 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, and then the Israelis retaliated 4 days later. But the interesting thing is that on April 14th, we saw that the idea of a regional coalition was not just an abstraction. This was the first time in Israel's history where attacks against Israel were actually intercepted by others, that Israel didn't have to do this all on its own. The Israeli defense performance was flawless, and they were responsible for knocking down 2/3 of all of the cruise missiles and the drones. 1/3 of those were intercepted by the US, by the British, and by the Jordanians and other members of Central Command, of which you have a number of Arab countries who are a part. Israel's ethos of defending itself by itself has always been, I would say, almost sacrosanct. It's been a part of the Israeli identity. But as they're confronting, according to the IDF, 7 fronts, counting all of the proxies, the need to have help was also quite clear. And the fact of the matter is they had help. Now, that's significant from a lot of different standpoints, but the point I wanted to make is this notion of a regional coalition is not just an abstract hope. We actually saw it operating in practice. And the administration wants to build on that. It sees that as a way also to ultimately and most effectively counter what the Iranians are doing with their proxies.
We invite your questions. I see we already have some, and we'll be getting them for Ambassador Ross a little later in the program, but you can put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we have time for shortly. Ambassador Ross, I heard earlier today that the Biden administration had let Netanyahu know that it was holding a shipment of offensive weapons, which seemed certainly symbolic, if not substantive. I'm sure there are lots of offensive weapons at the ready still in Israel. But is this one piece of what sounds to be an effort to broaden the negotiating players to not only accomplish a ceasefire, but to maybe edge Netanyahu and his priorities a little to the sideline?
Look, these reports they're out there. I saw them as well. They're a little bit vague as to whether they're weapons or it's ammunition. Is it something that is a kind of a deliberate thing designed to send a message? Or is it something, one of the issues we've had is that given everything we've been trying to provide to Ukraine as well as Israel, and the fact that we have provided a huge amount to Israel, much more than anybody knows. There is some question of whether or not we have the kind of stockpiles available to be continuing to provide Israel everything that we've been providing up until now. So is this actually a deliberate kind of signal? Is it a function of some genuine logistic issues? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. On the other hand, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and the president is making clear there's certain steps he'd like you to take, and suddenly you're being informed that in some of these areas we may not be able to provide what we've been providing certainly as quickly as we've been providing it. Will he interpret that as a signal, or will he see it as simply a function of a genuine logistic problem?
Netanyahu's constituency is a very diverse one. There are increasing crowds showing up to protest to demand the return of the hostages, some of them demanding a ceasefire. And Netanyahu finds himself fighting several different kinds of wars, the one for his own future, the one for the hostages, and the one that he's thinking of will serve him best, which is getting rid of Hamas altogether and doing whatever damage is being done in Gaza in the meantime. Has that shifted? Has his own battlefield and his own priorities, have they shifted?
He is in a, excuse me, he's in a much more complicated situation than he was previously. Partly it's a function of the pressures on the hostages. You know, Hamas has been quite manipulative in terms of how they've approached this. As I said, 10 days, 2 weeks ago, they said there's only 20 hostages alive in the categories that have been discussed before. Then they came out and released videos of 3 of the hostages. All of this basically increased the pressures within Israel to get the hostages released. There are many Israelis who say you can't claim victory if we're getting hostages back and they're not alive. That's not a victory. You will have failed them twice. This is a very strong feeling. Again, there's always been an ethos in Israel on the Israeli military that you never leave anybody in the field. Bibi Netanyahu presided over trading 1,026 Palestinian prisoners for one soldier, Gilad Shalit. Yahya Sinwar was one of that 1,026. The idea that you would trade 1,026 for one soldier, and you have all these, it started with close to 250 hostages. Now you have at least 136. The guess of how many is alive is still not that concrete. So there's a genuine pressure, not just from the families, but from within the body politic. On the other hand, he has members of his coalition, the ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. These guys are basically messianic nationalists, and they're saying, if you do this deal on the hostages, we leave the government. They're saying, if you don't go into Rafah, we leave the government. So he was buffeted by that, so much so that over the weekend on Shabbat, he from the prime minister's office, a senior political official who everybody knew to be the prime minister, released a statement saying, we're not going to end the war over this, and we will do Rafah. Now, for him to be releasing a statement during Shabbat suggested a level of angst about the pressure he was under from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and this was an effort to reassure them. So yes, there's a set of pressures that he's under. doing this deal right now, he cannot be in a position where he doesn't follow through on it. On the other hand, how does he manage the right wing of his coalition? He's often been, he's often been described as a magician. I once saw him when I was negotiating with him, and I came in and I said to him, I'm convinced that you have more than 10 fingers and 10 toes. And he sort of laughed and he said, what do you mean? I said, every time I come in, I look up at the wall, I see the dike, I see all the leaks in it, and somehow you manage to plug them all. He has a capacity and has always had a capacity to maneuver, but I would say that historically, he always had much more space to maneuver. He has much less space today.
Sounds like he's running out of fingers.
Or toes.
Janice alluded to something you wrote about the idea of making a unilateral ceasefire that kind of puts Hamas on the back foot and advantages Israel for however briefly. What are the prospects of something like that, especially from this government, and what would the advantage be?
Well, to put it in perspective, I called for it if there wasn't a hostage deal. I'm not favoring it in place of a hostage deal, but we have not had a hostage deal since November. We know the conditions that these hostages are in are almost incomprehensible. What they're going through is the kind of trauma that you would wish on no one. And so what I was trying to suggest is, if the approach you've been using to get hostages released continues to fail after 6 months, and once again, this major effort is not delivering, I was suggesting try a different approach. And a different approach would be a different way to put pressure on Hamas. By suddenly Israel taking an initiative, Israel being the one saying, okay, we're going to pause for 4 to 6 weeks. That I think would shift the focus and onus onto Hamas. It would create a different kind of pressure on Hamas than they've been under. It remains kind of extraordinary to me that the focus continues to be on Israel and not on Hamas. Hamas needs to be the recipient of pressure. This is another way to do it. In addition, you have, I don't need to tell you, the balance of public opinion internationally has shifted dramatically against Israel. Here's another way, I think, at least to begin to try to alter that set of perceptions. So I looked at it from a practical standpoint in terms of trying to shift the onus, from a practical standpoint that if the approach you've been using for 6 months hasn't yielded any more release of any more hostages, then try a different approach. And that's really what I was getting at. Now, it would also give the administration what it wants, which is a pause to deal with the humanitarian situation on the ground in a more systematic way, and to try to finalize with the Saudis as well. If you can't produce a hostage deal that was designed to produce that, this was again an alternative that I thought could be tried.
Until today, and the developments today, for some weeks, the biggest headlines and datelines about the war have been coming out of the United States and out of university campuses as well. And we've seen occasions where Palestinians have been on social media, thanking American students for standing up for their cause. As a consequence, some of the accusations about the Biden administration maybe being more aggressive about a ceasefire, about withholding weapons, if that in fact is the case, have been accusing it of cynical political manipulation rather than any larger global or regional interests.
Yeah, I don't see that. I think that there's, first of all, we're 7 months into this. So, to say they haven't stood by Israel would ignore the reality, number one. Number two, there's a genuine concern about, does Israel have a strategy that is leading to an outcome? And I think there is a concern that when the Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to talk about total victory, that sounds like more of a slogan than it does an objective. And my own position for some time has been Israel needs an objective that they can succeed in, and they're not far from one that exists, and that is the demilitarization of Gaza. And if the administration were to reach an understanding with Israel, how much is enough when it comes to demilitarization? You've done 19 of the 24 battalions, so Hamas is already no longer a military, but has reverted to a militia. You have destroyed a significant part of the military industrial base that Hamas built up in the military infrastructure. There's still a lot to be done in the tunnels, but I suspect they're there may be close to 40% of the tunnels. The point is, how much would be enough? And then given that, what would need to be the commitments that we would make with others to ensure you have a mechanism to ensure no remilitarization? If you've succeeded in the demilitarization of Gaza, so it can no longer be a platform for attacks against Israel, then you've actually succeeded in an objective that not only is significant, but also would be something Israel could claim legitimately as being a success. I think right now, what you see with the Biden administration is they're struggling to come up with an approach with the Israelis that allows you to get to the point where you can have a success. And part of what's driving, I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu are these pressures I was describing. From the right, they want the elimination of Hamas. The problem with that is it's not achievable. And one of the things, by the way, we're seeing, when David Petraeus used to talk about what you need to do, what we learned in Iraq was we needed to clear areas, then we needed to hold areas, and then we needed to build areas. He has suggested the same for the Israelis. The Israelis are finding they clear these areas, and then Hamas comes back in. They may not be organized the same way they were. They may be weaker than they were, but they still have plenty of people with guns. Israel had to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital after it had cleared it out. By the way, when they went back in, there were 1,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad there. There were 200 that were killed who resisted. There were 800 who they ended up arresting, who surrendered. In parts of northern Gaza, again, we've seen Hamas reappear or reemerge. So there is a need to have a plan and approach that deals with, okay, what comes next so that you don't leave a vacuum, so Hamas can't so easily come back in. And there are a number of different options that are available.
Are they militarily plausible, or are they just more of the same? I mean, in the sense of more civilian destruction, more infrastructure destruction.
I think they're totally different. I mean, one of the things the administration has been working on was to get Arab forces to come in and take the Israeli place. Now, there is some level of interest in this. I don't mean to suggest this is a simple proposition, because it's not at all clear that there are those who are prepared to come in and suddenly engage in firefights with Hamas if Hamas tries to reestablish itself. That would have to be understood. It can't be that they'll come in, but then they allow them to operate. The Israelis are basically saying, we're prepared to get to a point where we withdraw, but we want to be able to treat Gaza the way we're treating the West Bank right now, which is to say, rather than sending massive units back in, we send commando units back in as we see pockets of Hamas reemerge. So here again, you could work out a sequence where, okay, Israel gets out for a period of time, you need to create some kind of bridge to the future. Now, you can have several different elements to it. One can be create a humanitarian board that has international players like us, like the Europeans, regional players like the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, Moroccans, Jordanians, have them play a role in terms of dealing with restoring the basic humanitarian needs, have them play a role with what is an underlying structure of a bureaucracy that exists with Palestinians who have been there since the time of the Palestinian Authority, who were not politically identified, but had a functional responsibility under Hamas. You create this humanitarian board working with them. You bring in Arabs as part of the humanitarian board. You create some kind of transition, maybe with security contractors who play a role. The Israelis might, under those circumstances, still come in and come out. You get to a point where Arab forces can replace the Israelis, partly because you have weakened Hamas to the point where their inclination to resist will disappear. And there's one other factor here. I think the Palestinian public is so exhausted, so ready just to have a normal life. If you have Arab forces come in, they may not have to do much because the weight of the public will be such that Hamas is unlikely to do a lot. One point just to conclude with, the announcement that Hamas was accepting the proposal brought out a public demonstration of Palestinians in Gaza cheering this idea. again, a reminder of what actually the people on the ground want.
Let's go to some of your questions because there are a great many, Ambassador. Let me see as we scroll up here. Johanna wants to know why we talk of a ceasefire rather than a surrender.
Well, I don't think that Hamas is prepared to surrender. A ceasefire, first of all, we're talking about a ceasefire as part of a hostage deal. The difference between the two on this issue has been Hamas was insisting that the ceasefire had to end the war and Israel had to withdraw. Where there seems to have been some movement is Hamas at one point, and this is going back several months ago, had accepted the idea that there could be three phases of this approach. Phase one would involve the release of 40 hostages. Now we're talking about 33. It would not involve Israel committing to a permanent ceasefire. That would only happen in phase two. And then Hamas changed the position and said, no, there had to be an Israeli commitment to a permanent ceasefire to get even phase one underway. There are indications that Hamas has again made some moves in terms of saying, okay, that doesn't really have to happen until the second phase. There's a little ambiguity about this. There's some question about whether they've been given assurances that even if they don't get the commitment in phase one from the Israelis, that maybe the Egyptians or others are making commitment, or we're making a commitment. I highly doubt that the U.S. is making such a commitment because I don't think it could deliver on it. But I think there's some ambiguity about that, and I think that's some of the areas where the Israelis have some doubts about what the nature of the current proposal is. But if Hamas was showing signs it was ready to surrender, that would be one thing. The fact that they've been holding out and haven't been willing to do a hostage deal suggests that they did not feel under sufficient pressure. Certainly Yahya Sinwar didn't feel the need to have some kind of reprieve. Even that, I would say, even now, I'm not sure that's where he is, but I am struck by the fact that at least there was an interest in not saying no.
Let's see if we can get through more of these a little quickly because so many people have so many questions for you. Marcia is asking the question that comes up frequently, which is, why is Israel resistant to providing, I'm sorry, that's the wrong question. Best deal with the accusation that Israel is engaging in genocide. This is the PR war that we have seen expanding onto college campuses in the United States in recent weeks.
Well, one of the things I have to say that has always bothered me is when we see terms that embody something that's so horrific, the last thing in the world you want to do is cheapen the term or devalue it. There is a definition of genocide. It is the determined effort to eradicate a people or a group. There is no effort by Israel to eradicate the Palestinians in Gaza. Yes, we have numbers of people who've been killed and wounded that are terrible, but you have Israel from the beginning dropping leaflets having people evacuate. They weren't trying to eradicate the Palestinians in Gaza. So the idea this is a genocide is a perversion of the term. You're redefining the term. We should never have an interest in redefining a term like genocide.
And Manny wants to know, this is the question I bobbled here, why is Israel resistant to providing adequate amounts of humanitarian aid so that the Gazans have food? Again, we've seen spectacles of settlers or hostage families trying to stop trucks going into Gaza with relief supplies.
It's a very good question. And from the very beginning, one of the things I was pushing for was Israel to make sure they did everything that could be done to address the humanitarian need, because that was the only way to demonstrate two things. Number one, this was about Hamas, not about the Palestinians. And number two, it was the only way to gain the time and space Israel needed to ensure that it could defeat Hamas. Now, the reason that you didn't see that was within Israel, there was a sense that we have hostages being held. They are denied any access to medicine, any access to see what their conditions are by the Red Cross. You had people in Israel saying humanitarian assistance for humanitarian assistance. You had people on the right basically saying, why should we be doing anything, especially whenever you allow humanitarian assistance to go in, frequently Hamas is the one diverting it for its own purposes. So it was profoundly unpopular in Israel This was left to right. It wasn't just on the right. That, one way to deal with the reality of the hostages was to make it clear that, that there was going to be withholding humanitarian assistance. That was morally wrong. It wasn't tenable. And frankly, since the U.S. has been the critical player in terms of supporting Israel, militarily and politically, it was not something that, from an American standpoint, we could accept. So you've seen pressure from us build up after the killing of the accidental killing of the 7 aid workers working for World Central Kitchen. President Biden, I felt like it was a tipping point for him. He put a very different kind of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. We saw an immediate change. We saw northern crossing open into northern Gaza, which Israel said it would never do. We saw the number of trucks go from 100 up to over 400 a day. There was an immediate change. And frankly, it should have been something that the Israelis should have done from the beginning, but it's because the politics within Israel were quite negative on this. And it's true, there have been some even now who have been trying to block some of the shipments. A lot of trucks are actually originating in Jordan, and then they come through Israel. They're checked, they come through Israel, and in a couple of occasions, we've seen what are known as the Hilltop Youth. These are, again, kind of the Messianic nationalists, them go in and try to stop the trucks. We've seen some others, not necessarily the Hilltop Youth, but others who have basically lost soldiers on Gaza, seen some of their families also try to resist this. So it's a politically fraught issue in Israel because of the hostages, the way the hostages have been treated, and because Hamas has frequently diverted humanitarian assistance for its own purpose, by the way, denying it to the people for whom it's intended.
The flip side of that is a question that Jan addresses about why the Red Cross or Red Crescent haven't been allowed into Gaza to check on the hostages. Is Hamas not a signatory, or is it ignoring any of those humanitarian provisions that would be directed the other way toward the Israeli hostages?
Well, they're definitely not a signatory, but they don't respect this anyway. They've never allowed access for the Red Cross to hostages. By the way, there was one point earlier where there was an agreement in the mediation. Qatar got Hamas to agree to allow some medical supplies to be provided for the hostages. It looks like, in fact, even though it was sent into Gaza, it was never actually delivered.
Eric in Los Angeles says the Israeli government says moving Gazans out of Rafah to tents set up by the beach is doable, but he says the U.S. keeps saying that they don't like the Israeli plans for evacuation. Why would there be such a disconnect between the U.S. and Israel over this? Is it an American political consideration?
Again, there's so much that's out there right now where what's being reported sort of reflects a different context. The American position is that Israel should not carry out a massive ground campaign when you have 1.4 million people there, because there's no way to go in without a terrible civilian consequence. Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed over 2 months ago that Israel would come up with evacuation plans. The administration is saying the plans that have been presented so far, they don't find credible, that they're sufficient to be able to do the evacuation. By the way, the evacuation has two parts to it. It's not just having people leave, it's having them go to an area where they can be absorbed because shelter is available, food is available, water is available, medicine is available. The Israelis have been talking about an area called Moasi, which is not far from Rafah, and also Han Yunis, a city that the Israelis have gotten out of. But you still have to create the structure. What the Israelis have done in the last few days, there's about 50,000 tents that have been delivered. Now that helps if you're talking about 100,000 people. It doesn't help a lot if you're talking about, or certainly doesn't address what's needed if you're talking about 1.3 to 1.4 million people. Just the mere reality, the physical need, physical capability to move that many people is not a simple process. So what you're hearing from the administration is much more geared towards a massive ground onslaught when you still have well over 1 million people who are there. What began today was in an area where the Israelis had evacuations take place in a neighborhood where that is largely removed from the vast majority of the people who are still crammed into Rafah.
Do they think they can scale that up without addressing those very logistical problems of population that you just spoke to?
No, I think they know they have to do that, but I also think their plan is very much a sequential one. Instead of, taking on all of Rafah at one time, it's more to sort of go into a neighborhood by neighborhood. And where they are right now actually is more on the sort of Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing. One of the other concerns that the administration has had, Rafah has been the main crossing for humanitarian assistance. So if there's a massive ground onslaught in Rafah, does that mean that the whole crossing gets closed down and you're actually shutting off the humanitarian assistance? So this is a complicated undertaking. What you have on the Israeli side is, how can we say that we've really taken care of Hamas if there's 4 battalions that are still there? And we just got an indication that they exist because yesterday they fired mortars and a rocket. And that's what killed 4 Israeli soldiers and wounded another 8 or 10.
Jeffrey has a question about the effect in Israel of the demonstrations in this country. It says, and to what extent are Israelis concerned about the fact that younger people in the US are apparently becoming less supportive of Israel than their parents? He says, I'm concerned that this could impact US policy toward Israel in the future. And of course, that might depend very much also on what happens in November.
Look, I think that Israelis are mindful of it. I think they're concerned about it. I think they're concerned about it because I think they see potential drift, but it's also hard for them to get beyond where they are. Hostages are being held. Hamas is still there. Hamas carried out this horrendous attack on October 7th. Most of the attention in Israel is still geared towards that. I think there's a kind of underlying sentiment and awareness of what's happening, not just here, but in the rest of the world. There is a concern about that, but I don't think it's not the driving preoccupation now. I still think, look, we haven't yet had the political reckoning in Israel. That's still going to come. And I think part of that reckoning will involve, how does Israel reposition itself internationally? Who is most capable of being able to do that?
I have a question from Jim, who wants to know, and he's looking far into the future, a scenario under which a federal system of small states, majority Jewish, majority Palestinian, conceivable. Can it be created? Can it be maintained?
Look, I think there's all sorts of more creative ideas that are going to be necessary if we're going to move towards some kind of resolution over time between Israelis and Palestinians. The problem is, you have 2 societies who are completely traumatized. And I think I've said this before, when you have those who are still affected by trauma, they are consumed by their own sense of pain. They're incapable of absorbing or understanding that someone else is in pain. Right now, the Israelis can't contemplate the pain of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians cannot contemplate the pain of the Israelis. To think that we can go from this kind of a fundamental gap that in many ways takes us back to 1948, meaning the existential nature of this conflict, to 2 states is an illusion. On the other hand, from my own standpoint, the idea of 1 state is a guarantee for a forever conflict, because you have 2 national identities, 2 national movements. They're not going to coexist in 1 state. Is a confederal approach a possible way to go? Maybe. Jim was asking the question about different federal arrangements. I find that probably less likely as something that is probably doable. But I think we have to stretch our thinking in terms of how do you approach this problem in a way that gives you more of a chance to get from where we are to where we need to go. I would say we have to start by, once this actually is over, focusing on very practical forms, functional forms of cooperation. Health, water, environment, just showing that Israelis and Palestinians can actually cooperate again, just to create new baselines. That has to be a starting point.
Ira wonders whether there have become over these months any reliable sources or any reliable numbers for casualties for the dead and injured in Gaza, because the sources always seem to be questionable, or at least there's sources who have an advantage to present the numbers they have, no matter which side it's on. Is there any one neutral, reliable source for this sort of information?
No, I don't think so. Look, the Ministry of Health, which is run by Hamas in Gaza, they put out the numbers. They draw no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Israelis put out the numbers of those they think of Hamas fighters that have been killed. I think at this point, we really have no clear idea. We know there's a lot of people who've been killed. Is it 34,000, which is what is coming out of the health ministry? I don't know. For people who want to question that, I would say, okay, is it 25,000? Does that make us feel a whole lot better? I mean, I think the issue is there are large numbers of people who've been killed and wounded. It's a tragedy. That's what we want to get beyond. I think the numbers, we'll have to wait for this to be over to look for something that might be more objective.
As you pointed out, there are any number of internal forces and factions of different interests in Israel. And one of them, of course, is the settlements. And we've had several questions about the aggressive building of new settlements in the West Bank. And at what point does that become something put on the table as a gesture of goodwill to pull back about that? Or is that ever going to be anything that Netanyahu would consider even putting into play?
I think the only circumstance under which he would do it, I mean, it would cost him his government immediately, for sure. The only circumstance under which he would do it is if there is as part of the package with normalization, the Saudis are, what we are presenting that the Saudis would have accepted might involve something on the settlements, would involve something on the pathway to a Palestinian state. I myself, in conversations with Saudis, they are saying, look, we want something that demonstrates that this is different than the past. This is, is much more likely to result in a Palestinian state. One of the things I've raised with them is, you, on the one hand, want to create a kind of automaticity. The problem is you can't really have an automaticity, because if you have an automatic built-in timetable, what prevents Hamas from becoming the leader of that Palestinian state? What would guarantee that Palestinian state might not become part of the axis of resistance with Iran? What guarantees that the absence of institutions would prevent it from being a failed state? You don't want the Palestinian state to become, in a sense, a source of instability. I mean, the whole reason you want this is because you want to focus on the Vision 2030 and transforming Saudi Arabia domestically, and you don't want this conflict to be something that continues to bedevil the region and therefore you. So I've been pushing the idea of, how about we cross the threshold and we recognize the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which could mean a state or could mean a confederation, but it's their choice. But along with that right goes responsibilities. And you create some benchmarks for what has to be achieved to ensure the kind of Palestinian state that is going to emerge is a Palestinian state that actually is a contributor to peace and not a detractor from it.
Stephen and several other people want to know about the impact of Turkey stopping trade with Israel. I'm sure that means both the symbolic and the practical impacts.
I don't see, look, there have been efforts by the BDS movement for years to boycott Israel, and it doesn't work because what Israel has to offer the rest of the world is pretty important to the rest of the world. So you have Turkey has said they're stopping trade. To be honest, that hurts Turkey more than it hurts Israel. I don't see anybody else who is walking away from that. And again, the Abraham Accord countries have not walked away from the deal. Maybe they're going slower, but the reasons that they did this in the first place is because there are important things they gained from the Israelis. We're looking at this year in terms of climate change has produced deeper drought, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, and so who in the region, has answered their water problem? Well, it's Israel. Who deals with water security, food security, health security? The Israelis do. You are looking at states that have a relationship with Israel because it serves their interests. Turkey, because Erdogan relates to the Muslim Brotherhood, relates to Hamas, has defended Hamas. He makes this statement. But as I said, it is hurting Turkey more than it's hurting Israel.
Barry has a question. He said, I've not heard any discussion of de-radicalizing Gazans like the Germans and Japanese post-World War II. Right now, we hear recordings of IDF calling Gazans in Rafah to evacuate, and some say, quite frankly, they don't accept peace or help from Jews or Israelis and would rather they and their families would be bombed to show the world how evil the Jews are. I hadn't heard that, but is de-radicalization on the scale or the template of Germany and Japan even something that is under discussion or consideration, or is this a different order of magnitude?
Well, I think it's certainly something that Israelis talk about because they're worried that the population is completely radicalized. I think there are, you have experience both with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia, where they created these educational programs for those who had been members of Al Qaeda and of ISIS. There was a kind of, there's a kind of re-education. Look, I think one of the things you can do, the Emirates could create centers of excellence. One of the things about Palestinians is they want to be able to compete. They want to have an economy that gives them a chance to be part of the 21st century and compete. The Emirates have been very good at focusing on education within the UAE. One of the things they could do is they could contribute here to, in a sense, of education, which in itself has a lot to do with promoting a set of values, tolerance, and the like. To get the kind of de-radicalization that you had in Germany and Japan, this gets back to the earlier question. You had the complete surrender of the Germans and the Japanese. You're not going to get the complete surrender of Hamas. I mean, even if you end up in the end with Israel having succeeded in demilitarizing it, you're not getting Hamas to come out and say, we were defeated. We're not going to accept that. So, you can create the reality that they were defeated. You can create the reality they're no longer in control. I mean, we should make reconstruction conditioned on Hamas not being in control, because if Hamas is in control, everybody knows they will try to divert material and they'll try to go back to building the military industrial base that they took years to develop.
Ambassador, as you know, we try to conclude with a minute of something hopeful, and certainly we may be at the most hopeful junction in many weeks and months in this situation. So perhaps you can give us a little something.
Well, I do think that, as I said, this is the first time since November that I've seen Hamas decide that they did not want to be portrayed as saying no. And that's a little different. And whether it's a function of a kind of political pressure on them that they're feeling or military pressure that they're feeling, that I think is sort of a more hopeful development. And the fact that when I was in Saudi Arabia last week, I was struck by the fact that the Saudis still wanted to proceed with a normalization deal. It's not a given it's going to happen, but it says something about the shape of the region. And I would conclude lastly with one thought. There is an answer to Iran and its proxies, and we saw it basically on April 14th. There was a coalition of those who were willing to say, we're not going to let Iran and its proxies just decide to use military force and not have an answer for it. So that creates, I think, somewhat more hope for the future.
Ambassador Ross, today of all days, we're so grateful for your insights and for the information and analysis that you bring, and I'm sure we'll have occasion to bring you back frequently. Thank you again on behalf of our audience as well. Always good
to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we want to remind all of you to join us next week talking about political polling, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Excuse me, not next week, but Wednesday, 2 days from now. And next week, I'll be talking to the former head of Homeland Security and former governor of Arizona, Janet Napolitano, on how safe we actually are. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We look forward to talking to you next time.